Before we begin, I need to ask you something. If this story moves you, if it makes you think about courage in a way you have not thought about it before, subscribe to this channel. And when we reach the end, leave a comment telling me where you are watching from, your city, your state, your country. I want to know how far this story travels. Because what happened on a volcanic island in the Pacific Ocean on the 7th of July, 1944, deserves to be remembered everywhere. A 28-year-old man from Troy, New York, made a choice that morning that most of us cannot imagine making. He was wounded, unable to walk, and he knew exactly what was coming for him. He asked his fellow soldiers to prop him against a tree, give him a pistol, and leave him behind. What happened next would become one of the most haunting moments in the history of the United States military. This is the story of Private Thomas Baker and the last 8 bullets. The island of Saipan rises from the Philippine Sea like a jagged emerald, 15 miles long and no more than 6 miles wide at its widest point, a piece of volcanic rock covered in dense jungle and limestone cliffs that drop straight into the ocean. In the summer of 1944, this island became one of the most strategically vital pieces of land in the entire Pacific War. Whoever controlled Saipan controlled the air corridor to Tokyo. The new Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers, with their extended range and massive payloads, could reach the Japanese home islands from Saipan and return safely. For the Americans, capturing Saipan meant bringing the war directly to Japan's doorstep. For the Japanese, losing Saipan meant the beginning of the end. The invasion began on June 15, 1944. The United States 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions hit the beaches on the southwest coast under murderous fire from Japanese artillery positions dug into the hills. The Marines took horrific casualties in those first hours, wading through chest-deep water while machine gun fire tore through their ranks. But they established a beachhead, and within days, the 27th Infantry Division of the United States Army came ashore to reinforce them and push inland. Among those soldiers was Private Thomas Baker of Company A, 105th Infantry Regiment. Thomas Baker was not a career soldier. He was a working man from Troy, New York, a city on the Hudson River known for its factories and foundries. Before the war, he had lived an ordinary life, the kind of life that does not make headlines, the kind of life built on steady work and modest hopes. He was 28 years old when he landed on Saipan, older than many of the men in his unit, old enough to understand what war actually was. He was not looking for glory. He was not a man who spoke much about heroism or sacrifice. He was simply there, doing what needed to be done, because his country had asked him to do it. The fighting on Saipan was unlike anything the American soldiers had experienced before. The Japanese defenders, numbering more than 30,000 troops, had spent months fortifying the island. They had dug caves into the limestone cliffs, constructed bunkers reinforced with concrete and steel, and positioned artillery and machine guns to cover every approach. They had no intention of surrendering. The Japanese military doctrine at that time was built on a concept called Jyokusai, meaning shattered jewel, the idea that it was more honorable to die fighting than to accept the shame of surrender. Every yard of ground on Saipan would be paid for in blood. The 105th Infantry Regiment pushed north through the island's interior, moving through terrain that seemed designed to kill them. Dense sugarcane fields where visibility dropped to a few feet, ravines choked with jungle vegetation, hills honeycombed with caves that had to be cleared one by one, often with flamethrowers and satchel charges. The heat was suffocating, the humidity so thick that uniforms stayed soaked with sweat and never dried. Men carried 80-pound packs through mud that sucked at their boots with every step. They drank water that tasted like iodine and ate rations that had been sitting in the tropical heat until the cans bulged. At night, Japanese infiltrators crept through the American lines, slitting throats and throwing grenades into foxholes. No one slept deeply. No one felt safe. Thomas Baker distinguished himself early in the campaign. He was not an officer. He held no rank beyond private. But he had something that could not be taught in basic training. He had the kind of calm under fire that other men noticed and drew strength from. When his company encountered a fortified Japanese machine gun position that had pinned down an entire platoon, Baker grabbed a bazooka and moved forward through the gunfire. He took his time, found his angle, and destroyed the position with a single shot. When another machine gun opened up from a different direction, he did it again. Men who fought alongside him remembered that he did not hesitate. He did not freeze. He simply saw what needed to be done and did it. In close combat, Baker was equally effective. There were moments during the Saipan campaign when the fighting dissolved into something primal and terrifying, when soldiers found themselves face to face with enemy troops in the darkness, too close for rifles, fighting with knives and entrenching tools in bare hands. Baker killed Japanese soldiers in that kind of fighting. He did what he had to do to survive and to protect the men around him. He did not talk about it afterward. He did not boast. The other soldiers in Company A began to look at him differently, not with awe exactly, but with the kind of respect that comes from seeing a man perform under the worst possible conditions and never break. By the end of June, the Japanese forces on Saipan were surrounded, pushed back into the northern tip of the island with nowhere left to retreat. Their supply lines had been severed. They had no food, no ammunition reserves, no hope of reinforcement. The commander of the Japanese forces on Saipan, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Sato, understood that the battle was lost. He understood that the island would fall and that the American bombers would soon be striking Tokyo. But surrender was not an option. Japanese military culture in 1944 did not permit it. Sato made his decision. He would order one final attack, a massive Banzai charge that would throw every remaining soldier at the American lines in a last desperate attempt to break through, kill as many Americans as possible, and die with honor. On July 6, 1944, Sato composed his final orders. Then he committed ritual suicide. The men of the 105th Infantry Regiment had no idea what was coming. They had been fighting for 3 weeks straight, grinding through the island yard by yard, and they were exhausted. 80% of the regiment had already become casualties, killed or wounded in the brutal fighting. The survivors were hollow-eyed and gaunt, running on adrenaline and willpower. On the night of July 6th, they dug in along a defensive line near the village of Tanapag on the island's northwest coast. Their position stretched across a coastal plain with the ocean to their left and rising ground to their right. There were gaps in the line. There had to be. They did not have enough men to hold a continuous front. The officers knew it. The soldiers knew it. They set up what defenses they could, strung barbed wire, positioned machine guns, and waited. The attack began at 4:30 in the morning on July 7th, just before dawn, when the sky was still black and the world was painted in shades of gray. The first thing the American soldiers heard was not gunfire. It was voices. Thousands of voices, screaming in Japanese, a sound that rose from the darkness like something out of a nightmare. Then the Japanese soldiers appeared, running toward the American lines in a human wave, shoulder to shoulder, packed so tightly that there was no space between them. Some carried rifles with bayonets fixed. Some carried swords. Some carried nothing but sharpened bamboo stakes. They had been told to run forward and never stop, to crash into the American positions and fight until they were dead. The American machine gunners opened fire, and the noise became deafening. The Browning M1917 heavy machine guns roared, spitting out 500 rounds per minute, cutting through the charging Japanese soldiers like a scythe through wheat. Men fell in rows, their bodies piling up in front of the American positions, but the wave did not stop. More soldiers kept coming, climbing over the bodies of the dead, screaming, firing wildly as they ran. The American riflemen fired as fast as they could work their bolts, but there were too many targets, too many men rushing out of the darkness. The barbed wire slowed the attackers for a few seconds, tangling their legs, but they pushed through it, ripping their skin open on the barbs, leaving pieces of flesh behind. The Japanese soldiers found the gaps in the American line and poured through. The defensive front collapsed almost immediately. What had been a battle line became a chaotic nightmare of small groups of soldiers fighting for their lives in isolated pockets. Japanese troops were behind the American positions, in front of them, all around them. There was no front anymore. There was no rear. There was only confusion and violence, and the terrible knowledge that the enemy was everywhere. Thomas Baker was somewhere in that chaos. Exactly where, exactly when, the historical record does not say with precision. What is known is that he kept fighting. When the Banzai charge broke through the lines and Company A disintegrated into scattered groups, Baker did not run. He stayed where he was and fired his rifle at the shapes moving through the darkness. He fired until the weapon jammed, choked with dirt or carbon, or maybe just worn out from too much use. He threw it down and picked up another rifle from a dead soldier and kept firing. Around him, men were dying. Officers were shouting contradictory orders. Wounded soldiers were screaming for medics. The noise was so loud that it became almost meaningless, a wall of sound that made thinking impossible. At some point during that morning, Thomas Baker was hit. A bullet or shrapnel or a bayonet, the records do not specify. What matters is that the wound was serious enough that he could not walk. His legs would not hold him anymore. He was on the ground, bleeding, and the battle was still raging around him. Other soldiers saw him and tried to help. They tried to carry him back to get him to an aid station to save him, but Baker refused. He told them no. He told them that he was not going to let them die trying to save a man who was already finished. He told them to leave him. The men arguing with him did not want to leave him. No soldier wants to abandon a wounded comrade, but Baker was insistent, and he was right. Carrying a wounded man through that kind of fighting was a death sentence for everyone involved. The soldiers who wanted to save him would have been cut down before they made it 20 yards. Baker knew this. He looked at them and told them what to do. "Prop me against that tree," he said. "Give me a pistol and 8 rounds, then go." They did what he asked. They carried him to a tree at the edge of the fighting and positioned him so that he was sitting upright, his back against the trunk, facing the direction the Japanese soldiers were coming from. Someone handed him a Colt M1911 pistol, the standard-issue sidearm of the United States military, a .45 caliber semi-automatic that held 7 rounds in the magazine and 1 in the chamber. 8 bullets total. Baker took the weapon, checked it, and looked at the men standing over him. "Go," he said again. And this time they went. They left him there, sitting alone against that tree, wounded and unable to move, with 8 bullets and whatever time he had left. What Thomas Baker thought about in those final minutes, no one will ever know. Perhaps he thought about Troy, New York, about the streets he had walked as a boy, about the people he had known before the war changed everything. Perhaps he thought about his family, about whether they would understand why he had made this choice. Perhaps he thought about the men in his company, the soldiers he had fought beside for the past 3 weeks, and hoped that leaving him behind would give them a better chance to survive. Or perhaps he thought about nothing at all except the task in front of him, the simple mathematics of 8 bullets, and the enemy soldiers who would be coming through the trees at any moment. The battle raged on around him. The Banzai charge continued for hours, waves of Japanese soldiers throwing themselves at the American positions with suicidal determination. Some American units were completely overrun. Some held their ground at devastating cost. Artillery batteries were ordered to fire directly into their own positions to stop the enemy advance. The fighting was so close and so confused that American shells were landing among both Japanese and American troops, killing everyone within the blast radius without discrimination. Men fought with bayonets, with knives, with their fists. The wounded lay where they fell because there was no way to reach them. The dead were everywhere. Thomas Baker sat against his tree and waited. He would have heard the battle, the gunfire and explosions and screaming, growing closer or fading away depending on how the fighting shifted. He would have felt his strength draining away as the blood leaked out of his body. He would have known, with absolute certainty, that he was going to die on this island, that he would never see home again, that this tree and this piece of ground would be the last thing he ever saw. And still, he held that pistol and watched the jungle in front of him. When the Japanese soldiers came, he killed them, one by one methodically without wasting a single shot. The pistol in his hand barked 8 times and 8 men fell. He did not miss. He did not panic. He did not try to save ammunition or hold anything back. He used every bullet he had been given, and when the hammer fell on an empty chamber, Thomas Baker was finished. The Banzai charge was finally repelled by mid-morning. The Japanese assault had spent itself, breaking against the American defenses like a wave against a seawall. More than 4,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead on the battlefield, their bodies scattered across the coastal plain in grotesque piles. The 105th Infantry Regiment had been shattered. Of the men who had dug in the night before, roughly 80% were now casualties. Entire companies had ceased to exist as fighting units. The survivors walked through the aftermath in a daze, stepping over corpses, looking for friends who were no longer alive. When the soldiers went looking for Thomas Baker, they found him still sitting against the tree where they had left him. He was dead. The pistol lay in his hand, the slide locked back on an empty magazine. In front of him, arranged in a rough semicircle, were the bodies of 8 Japanese soldiers. He had fired 8 times and 8 men had died. He had not missed once. Not in the chaos, not while wounded and bleeding, not in what must have been the final moments of his life. 8 bullets, 8 kills, and then silence. The men who found him stood there for a long time, looking at the scene, trying to process what they were seeing. This was not the kind of heroism that came with fanfare or dramatic music. This was something quieter and more terrible. This was a man who had known he was going to die and had decided that if death was coming for him, he would meet it on his feet, or as close to his feet as his ruined body would allow. He would not beg. He would not hide. He would do his job until the very last second, and then he would be done. Lieutenant Colonel William J. O'Brien, the commanding officer of one of the battalions in the 105th Infantry Regiment, also died during the Banzai charge. When his position was overrun and he ran out of ammunition, he grabbed a saber from a dead Japanese officer and charged into the enemy formation, swinging the blade until he was cut down. Captain Ben L. Salaman, a dentist serving as a surgeon with the regiment, was killed while defending a field hospital. When Japanese soldiers broke through and began killing the wounded men lying on stretchers, Salaman picked up a rifle and fought them off, killing dozens of enemy soldiers before he was finally overwhelmed. His body was found slumped over a machine gun, surrounded by the bodies of 98 Japanese troops. All 3 men, O'Brien, Salaman, and Baker, would later be awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration for valor that the United States can bestow. But medals and decorations came later, after the island was secured, after the bodies were buried, after the reports were written and the recommendations were made. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, there was only exhaustion and grief, and the knowledge that the cost of taking Saipan had been almost unimaginable. The island was declared secure on July 9, 1944, 2 days after the Banzai charge. The Japanese defenders were effectively annihilated. Of the more than 30,000 Japanese troops on the island, fewer than 1,000 were taken prisoner. The rest died fighting or committed suicide. Hundreds of Japanese civilians, convinced by their own government's propaganda that the Americans would torture and kill them, jumped from the cliffs at the northern end of the island rather than surrender. Mothers threw their children into the sea and then jumped after them. The cliffs became known as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, names that would carry the horror of those deaths forward through history. The American casualties were also staggering. More than 3,000 United States servicemen were killed during the Battle of Saipan, and over 10,000 were wounded. The 27th Infantry Division, and the 105th Infantry Regiment in particular, had been gutted. The men who survived would carry the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. They would wake up at night hearing the sound of thousands of voices screaming in the darkness. They would flinch at loud noises. They would struggle to explain to people back home what it had been like, and eventually, most of them would stop trying. The strategic importance of Saipan, however, was undeniable. Within months, the United States Army Air Forces began constructing massive air bases on the island. By November 1944, B-29 Superfortress bombers were taking off from Saipan and striking targets in Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and other Japanese cities. The bombing campaign that followed would devastate Japan's industrial capacity and civilian infrastructure, killing hundreds of thousands of people and hastening the end of the war. The path from Saipan to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, from the invasion beaches to the atomic bombs that ended the conflict, was a direct line. Thomas Baker and the men who died on Saipan made that path possible. Their sacrifice, bought with blood on a volcanic island most Americans had never heard of, changed the course of history. Thomas Baker was posthumously promoted to the rank of sergeant and awarded the Medal of Honor on June 19, 1945. The citation accompanying the medal describes his actions in dry, official language, the kind of language that military bureaucracies use to describe events that defy language. It mentions his repeated acts of bravery, his destruction of enemy positions, his refusal to be evacuated, and his final stand. It does not mention what it must have felt like to sit against that tree, alone and dying, waiting for the enemy to come. It does not mention the sound of the pistol firing 8 times in the jungle morning, or the silence that followed. Those details exist in the space between the words, in the things that cannot be written down or captured in official records. The men who served with Baker, the ones who survived, carried his memory with them. They told the story of the last 8 bullets to their families, to their children, to anyone who would listen. They wanted people to know what kind of man he had been. Not a superhero, not a myth, just a man from Troy, New York, who had done his duty in the most impossible circumstances imaginable, and had never asked for anything in return except that his friends leave him behind and save themselves. That was the kind of courage that haunted people, the kind that made them question whether they would have been able to do the same thing if the situation had been reversed. Saipan today is a peaceful place. The jungle has reclaimed most of the battlefields. The caves where Japanese soldiers fought and died have been sealed or turned into memorials. Tourists visit the island for its beaches and its diving, unaware that they are walking over ground where thousands of men killed each other in the summer of 1944. There are monuments scattered across the island, plaques and markers that commemorate the battle and the people who died there. Some mention Thomas Baker by name. Most do not. History is like that. It remembers the big events, the strategic turning points, the generals and the politicians. The individual soldiers, the ones who actually did the fighting and the dying, fade into the background unless their stories are told and retold until they become part of the collective memory. Thomas Baker's story deserves to be remembered, not because it is unique, though it is extraordinary, but because it represents something fundamental about human beings under extreme pressure. It is a story about choice. Baker could have accepted evacuation. He could have let other men risk their lives to carry him to safety, and no one would have blamed him for it. Wounded soldiers are evacuated from battlefields all the time. It is the right thing to do. It is what is supposed to happen. But Baker looked at the situation, assessed the odds, and made a different choice. He chose to stay behind so that others might live. He chose to spend his last minutes doing the only thing he could still do, which was to kill enemy soldiers and buy his comrades a few more seconds, a few more yards, a few more chances to survive. That choice, made in the darkness and chaos of a collapsing battlefield, is worth remembering. It is worth thinking about. It is worth honoring, not by building monuments or naming buildings, but by refusing to let the story disappear. Because the story is not really about violence or war or killing. It is about what people are capable of when everything is stripped away except the essential core of who they are. Thomas Baker, in the last minutes of his life, showed the world exactly who he was. He was a man who kept his promises. He was a man who understood the cost of courage. He was a man who fired 8 bullets and did not miss. The Second World War ended in August 1945, a little over a year after the Battle of Saipan. Japan surrendered unconditionally after the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bombs that were delivered by B-29 bombers flying from Saipan and other islands in the Mariana Chain. The connection is direct. The men who died taking Saipan made the endgame possible. Thomas Baker's last stand, and the stands of thousands of men like him, paid for the victory that followed. In the decades since the war ended, military historians have analyzed the Battle of Saipan from every possible angle. They have debated tactics and strategy, questioned decisions made by commanders on both sides, examined the intelligence failures, and the communication breakdowns that contributed to the chaos of the Banzai charge. But no amount of analysis can fully explain what happened on the morning of July 7, 1944, when a private from Troy, New York, sat against a tree with a pistol and 8 rounds of ammunition, and decided that he was not going to die quietly. Thomas Baker made a choice that morning that transcended tactics and strategy. He made a choice that was fundamentally human and fundamentally heroic, and he paid for that choice with everything he had. The people who visit Saipan today, who walk along the beaches and look out at the Philippine Sea, have no way of knowing where Thomas Baker died. The exact tree is not marked. The precise location is lost to time, but somewhere on that island, on a piece of ground that looks like every other piece of ground, a man made his last stand. He fired 8 times and he did not miss, and then he was gone. The jungle grew back over the spot. The rains came and washed away the blood. The years passed and the world moved on, but the story remains as long as someone is willing to tell it. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about sacrifice and courage in a new way, I want to ask you to do something. Subscribe to this channel so that more stories like this one can be told. Leave a like on this video, but more than that, I want to hear from you. I want you to leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. Your city, your state, your country. I want to know how far the memory of Thomas Baker has traveled. I want to know that his story is reaching people all over the world, people who will remember what he did and why it mattered. Share your thoughts about this story. Tell me what it made you feel. Tell me if you think you could have made the same choice he made, sitting against that tree, knowing what was coming. These are not easy questions, but they are important ones, and Thomas Baker, wherever he is, deserves to have people still asking them. Leave your comment below. Tell me where you are. And never forget the last 8 bullets.